Welcome everyone to the Product Ops Chronicles with myself, Graham Reed, and my co-host and Product Ops pal, as always, Antonia Landi. Antonia, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, as always.
You're welcome. Today we are joined by two Chris's, Chris Butler and Christopher Fox. Chris Butler, let me hand over to you. Do a quick intro to yourself.
Sure, I'm staff product ops at GitHub, and in particular, my role is called portfolio operations. And so I'm actually an embedded product ops person with the team that does all the AI products coming out of GitHub.
Awesome. Thank you. And Christopher.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Christopher Fox. I'm currently Director of Product Operations at Dashlane. So in charge of the product operations function, partnering with many cross-functional partners across the org, making sure that we do product well.
Lovely. Thank you both. And thank you for both for taking the time to join us today. Our topic today is something that my two guests were discussing at a recent industry event, and also a very common term used to describe product operations. And you may, if you've heard this yourself, this may resonate with you. And that is product operations is the product manager to product managers, to product management, and the product management team.
I would say like PMing the PM experience is the way that I've colloquially put it. Yeah.
PM in the PM experience. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I personally think there is some merit in this description, but I think it's like so much in our profession, even more of a common term. It really depends. So let's dive in and start. I'd really like to start by going around the group for some high-level thoughts on this. And Chris, let me hand over to you first. What's your thoughts on this?
I guess I first started saying PMing the PM experience just because it seems an awful lot like when we look at other operational roles that already exist today. So, we could talk about like business operations or finance would be those types of things originally. Then there was this idea of adaptation to that of like development. And so DevOps and that in between of how does development actually then work in some way with like the live systems that are there. But then we have research ops, design ops, all these different ops. And so I guess I saw this as inside of a good team, there's lots of different healthy tensions between different roles. And so for me, my role is to focus very much on the way that the PMs do their job, the dynamics of their group, the way the leadership works with the ICs and et cetera, to be able to actually then work alongside other types of operational roles in some way. And so, I did the Product Ops certified course for PLA. And so that's why I try to essentially prioritize the different types of customers that we have. And so I've always put PMs at the top of that. I put probably our partners right below that, the leadership of the PM team. And then way below that, 999 is the customer itself. And so that's why I tend to think that we need to be focused. We need to really be understanding what is going on with that team and then work with other groups that are probably operational groups as well. So I'm part of a virtual team at GitHub that includes what we'll call TPMs, where they're really much more about project or program management. And they are actually folded underneath the engineering org. And then I also work with T-BOMs, which are, I believe, business owners of some type. I forget what the actual term is, but they basically are chief of staff for the engineering leads or VPs. And so I guess what I would say is I am working with these other operational roles as a virtual team. But that's kind of the reason why I think about PM product ops as PMing PM experience is that I'm really hyper focused on the PM itself and the PM practice at that organization.
There was a really interesting piece, and Christopher, I'll move over to you in a second. There's a really interesting thing that you said there, though, about how you kind of stack rank the the different people that you work with, that you interact with, but that you have put customers, external customers of the business, right at the very, very bottom. And this is obviously very much an internally facing role, function within the business, which in this day and age is something that's actually quite unusual. And I don't mean unusual in terms of doesn't happen. It's unusual in terms of actually the popularity of it. We're in an age whereby everything is, we've got to be customer obsessed and focused. Everybody needs to be doing this, but actually we're not.
Well, and to be clear, I am customer obsessed. It's just my customer is the PM, and
we'll come
my
on
product is the product community practice, the community of practice around PMing. It's the individual experience of the PM. And so that's why like I am very, very customer obsessed. It's just that I guess that's what I'm saying is I'm trying to say that this is my customer rather than some end user of actually the things that we build, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Christopher, your thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, Chris, loved the PLA Product Operations Certification course. Really good stuff. I tend to agree with your position that product ops is a PM for PMs, but I'm also on the it depends side here. I think that it depends primarily on your organization and your context. I do think that, especially in smaller roles, what I tend to find is that product operations needs to act more broadly. Honestly, I would prefer to just be a PM for the PM experience, but for me, my product is how we make product teams effective. It's not so much just the PMs. I think they're critical in how that comes to fruition, how a product team can be effective. But a lot of times, like I said, especially in smaller organizations, that relies on an empowered triad, maybe, depending on how your organization is structured. That might be the PM doing PM work very well, but it also might be coaching and working with product designers. And depending on your organization, you might have dedicated design ops roles to help you with that. You might have, founder mode managers maybe who are down in the weeds, really working with individual contributors and, making them do things a certain way. But for me, I think focusing on my product is doing good product work for the business helps me focus a little bit more broadly on different types of issues than it would if I sort of limited myself to just thinking about the PMs. And secondarily, I think that if I just focused on the PMs, I would end up putting a lot of pressure on the PMs. And that's something ultimately I do want to avoid. So in other words, I would conceptualize this as I have a portfolio of products as a product operations person, and one of them is being a PM for the PM experience.
Can I disagree with all three of you? Just real quick.
Love it. Antonia.
Graham didn't even say anything about this yet, okay? Graham didn't say anything about this yet, but go ahead, yeah.
Chris, I remember when you sort of started using that phrase or kind of coined that phrase, PMing the PM experience a few years ago. And I was like, brilliant, absolutely on point, exactly what we're doing. Recently, I've had to ask myself whether that does what we do justice. Because I've said for a long time, my product is the product organization. Right now, whether we want to split this into PMs only, PM design engineering, QA data, whatever it is, right? But my product is the product organization. However, what I care about most is that a better product is produced, right? That is beneficial to our company, like as a business, right? Financially. Now, saying that my product is the product organization doesn't make that explicit. And I think saying that we are an internal facing role, while technically accurate, leaves us open for misinterpretation, right? Mm. That's when we start thinking about our product as maybe processes, maybe frameworks, right? Maybe our ways of working. But what I've started doing is saying that, yes, sure, these are the tangible things we work on. However, these should always be in service of building a better end product, right? Of building a better end result. And in that way, Chris, I think I disagree with you in that I would rank the customers higher. Simply, even if it's just as a reminder of what we're there to enable, if that makes sense.
Well, this is interesting to me because I guess, I do a lot of work also around like decision making and strategy in general. And so, I helped co-found this group called the Uncertainty Project, where we talk a lot about decision making. And I think there's this one kind of issue that people have around decision making is that they decide whether a decision making process was good or bad based on whether it had a good or bad outcome. And what I would say is that what we're kind of backing into is that once our job is to actually say that that's a successful product in the marketplace, that I think puts us in a place where we would then do anything that a PM just is kind of like overflow, rather than the idea, my job is to focus on the way that those PMs make decisions. And that, yeah, ideally we can start to understand, like, on average, are we making better decisions? But I'm not actually as worried about the outcome because there's so many factors that go into a great product, right? It's not just did the PM team, do the right thing? Did they talk the right way? Did they have all the right kind of conversations and trade-off discussions? But it's actually like market volatility, the technology environment. Like, at GitHub, for example, we were a first mover in this space when it comes to kind of like code completions using LLMs. And now there's like lots of people that are doing this type of thing, right? And so there's a huge competitive threat. And so from that perspective, we're also just to add on top of that, we're owned by Microsoft, right? So there's all of the different things that come with being part of Microsoft, helping enable things like VS and VS Code, that idea. And so I guess that's where I would again disagree, is that I think that by us focusing on this end product of the thing, that we're actually losing sight of where we can have the biggest impact. And that's why, like, for me, leverage on like how we help the PMs be better is actually getting them to do an amazing job at this. But the outcome is something that is still so many different factors that even the PMs themselves, when they're an amazing PM, it just means they're more likely right, not that they are always right. Right. Yeah, and even if they are always right, it's probably survivorship bias is probably what it is, because they're just like, they're actually making it through. And this is like a real issue, I think. That's why during a Q&A, I was talking about how I think like leadership change and the way leaders work is actually my biggest and hardest problem. And the reason why is because people are continuously, as leaders in these groups, they've rised up in the ranks because they were successful in some way. But the problem is that success is not always just because they were great thinkers or they were building great teams. Some of it is luck, and some of it is just like timing. And so from that perspective, and this is related to something called dominant logic theory, where, leadership gets into this place where they're constantly using the models of the past kind of times they were successful, even if it's not appropriate now. So I think that's where what I'm constantly trying to fight against is this model that PMs know exactly what is the right thing to do, and that my job is to help them figure that out, essentially. Yeah, because I think that absolutely not leveraging uncertainty, being very certain about your role, actually creates a lot of kind of blinders for people to make better decisions. So that would be my argument against this idea of like the end product is actually, it's not that it's not important, right? It's what pays the bills for us to all be employed, and we're trying to create value for customers and for the business as PMs. But as a product ops person, my job is to basically like create meaningful roles that people can feel really successful in. And I think that is like a different way of thinking about it. Organizational dynamics cause so much when it comes to the success of that, I would argue, but it's not always the success because we don't know if we can be successful all the time.
Absolutely. And I would never measure the success of a product operations team based on how well the product performs, right? Like you say, there are
no ARR numbers for product ops or anything like that.
There are an insane number of factors that go into that. But at the same time, I think we have to stay very mindful, right? That any piece of work we do is in service of that mission of building better products at the end of the day.
It's interesting. Yeah. Go on, Christopher, you go first. Go on.
Yeah, I just want to kind of lean into the argument a little bit on this one, Chris. Whenever I think about the different things that I can do as a product operations person to help a product manager be more effective, if I limit myself to just their scope, product managers are already a very cross-functional group of people. They must work with other parts of the business. They have to know what signals to look for. It's a lot of juggling, right? And so, if I focus on their experience, I may figure out, hey, they need better access to sales numbers, or hey, they need better access to product analytics. But for me, whenever I do my listening tour, right, whenever I go talk to cross-functional partners, if I hear something like the product team never builds what our customers really want, or I keep losing deals and they never build the features that I think will help us win more deals, like these things to me are symptoms. And by treating sales engineers, customer success people in B2B focused organizations, of course, if I'm focusing on these people and their needs as well, it might actually help me identify new problems to solve that help the product team be more effective. And therefore, yes, I am serving the PM in a way, but if I'm focusing on the holistic process, the holistic decision-making framework, then I might actually have better outcomes, not just for that product team and their experience, but also the product in the end, because they're focusing on the right problems to solve. So for you, whenever you approach this, do you find yourself working on these sets of problems when you conceptualize this as a PM of the PM experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think inside of our org structure, we end up having centralized teams that are kind of focused on, I think this is like maybe getting to some of the things you were talking about are like sales enablement. I would put like user research, data science. There's a bunch of things that I think that product ops ends up helping with. And I think usually centralized teams, like we have a whole centralized team around kind of release tracking. We have a whole centralized team around the idea of like feedback and the way that we do escalation of feedback based on like sales needs, right? And so I think there is maybe a difference here when it comes to kind of embedded product ops people, right? So I'm there to make sure that basically two leaders and their teams are as successful as possible or as enabled as possible, right? I think what's interesting about this is that I could imagine that for maybe this is the thing too, is when I see that Venn diagram about product management, right, that is very like popular, where it's like engineering, business, and user, basically. What I see with that is not necessarily that I have to have an overlapping understanding of all those skills, but it's that I have to work with those organizations in some way. And so I think this idea of more of a meta skill around, say, decision making or trade-off discussions or something like that is a PM skill, but it almost doesn't matter what types of other practices you're working with. We just happen to most of the time as PMs, like I put on my PM hat, working with engineering and design is kind of the traditional way, the triad type of thing, or we call it EPD at GitHub. But I've worked on plenty of projects where we would have legal and we would have responsible AI or security, privacy, feedback, customer support, right? And so I'm not an expert really in any of those. I know as a PM how to have good trade-off discussions with them. And that's what I would argue the skill is for PMs to develop. And so that's one thing. I think like for PMs, it's more about this like generalized skill set around how do we make decisions? How do we make trade-offs? How do we do things like that? And so that's why, to me, I want to help those PMs do that. Or communication is another great example of where like every time I go into an organization, someone asks to basically, we need to up-level the writing here because, at Google is people were writing way too much. They were writing these like 40-page documents that no one was reading, basically. At other places, it's that we need to like, the writing is just not succinct enough. It's not clear, right? And so in that case, like that is something that's hyper-specific. Yes, there are like, how does an engineer read this document, right? That is important as like an understanding. But it's me giving the tools to the PM to understand, are they actually getting across the message they need, rather than me just specifically saying we're going to now build documents for engineers. So that's why like I think that there's something specific about that. I'd also say that like I think product ops has a hazard for potential product ops is what happened to HR. And HR is basically there to protect the company. But the reality is HR was supposed to be there to help take care of the employees, right? And so what I worry about in the future of like product operations is that it's not so much about like, how do we get into this very generalized role? I would argue that the future of this stuff is that we should actually have a cross-functional team of people that are worrying about org dynamics. And that's the proto version of that are these like virtual ops groups that we end up forming at these different places. So again, that's why I think, from that perspective, and again, I totally realize that when you're in a startup or a much smaller organization, right, like you put on a lot of hats, right? Like when I did my startup, I was not only like the product person, but I was also the salesperson, and I did like a third of my time doing development, right? So should I have been doing all those? Ideally not, right? Because there's problems that come up with me encapsulating all those things. Just like someone who's a project manager and a product manager together, like that's bad because you don't have the good tensions between those two different roles, basically. So I want to acknowledge that, but I want to say that I think like the future of this thing is for people to be specialists in different types of practices, like engineering, right? If you're going to be an expert in like engineering, it's a lot about like, how do we end up creating maintainable code, right? How do we actually end up like iterating on things? How do we still experiment and not get locked into things? How do we decide to optimize versus this idea of innovate? And all that stuff is very specific to engineering practice. And in fact, we have like L&D people that are engineering, right? Because we're a large org. And so that's what I'd say is I think, again, I see there being different practice differences for each of these roles. And that's why I would then, again, argue that like product ops is really about just PMing the PM experience. Now, should we have engineering the PM experience? And I agree, yes, we should. We need those things. We actually have someone on our team that is basically an engineer that builds automations for the product ops team. So I think, again, we're getting into this realm where you need to have cross-functional groups that are building these things in some way. Whether that means we then get into a generic space, again, like HR, and HR includes not just like experts that are, say, fielding problems, but they're also building HR systems sometimes, right? And so that's where I think there's some interesting analogies here that I think are for good or for bad, because I think HR got into a place where it's protecting the organization and not helping the actual employees anymore. So, yeah.
You mentioned engineering the PM experience, but what about PMing the engineering experience? And I think that's where I'm more on the side of Christopher, right? I've done both. I've done product ops exclusively for product managers. I've done product ops for the product organization. And something that I obviously, my strong suit, my home base is product, but I then acted almost as a systems thinking internal consultant, right, to other functions where the engineering leaders had a particular organizational issue or something that, needs to be thought through. And I don't have specific domain expertise, but because of that sort of bird's eye view of really how work gets done within the organization, I could still help them come up with a suitable potential solution. Right. So maybe the future of product ops is hiring systems thinkers, right? Very generically, rather than specialists. Who knows?
Well, I mean, that would be John Cutler's argument, right? Is he's a very much a systems thinker, right? Yeah. And so he thinks about that thing. I think the PM for the engineer experience, like PMing the engineer, I think is really interesting, but the customer is different. Right. If I'm PMing the engineer experience, my customer is engineering and I need to worry about 100%. The problems of engineering and things like that. So that's why, like, again, I think this is why when we get into this realm of we're trying to service everybody, we serve no one. Right. And when we're trying to be hospitable to everybody, we're hospitable to no one. And so that's where that's why I think like, there should be probably a PM for the engineering experience, and there should probably be some type of operational role over there. Most of the operational roles I see end up being like program management, which I kind of is in the realm of operational role. I don't want to say that they are explicitly, but they can be sometimes, right? And they do the thinking that I think is like the PMing for the engineering experience. It's just that their goal is to make sure the engineers' experience in community of practice is as good as possible, basically.
Any final thoughts on this? Please go on, Christopher.
Yeah, if I think about the future of product operations, I go back to like an org design theory. I kind of see this parabolic curve. As a small organization, you might have more of that PMing the PM experience. You might actually have more of the PM of product teams. And as you start to scale, you might broaden your scope a little bit. But as you get larger, it goes back down again into specialization. And I think this is supported by some of the work that, the product operations book, Melissa Perry, Denise Tillis, like, what they argue there is that as your product operations team grows, you're focusing on those pillars, business data and insights, the tools and best practices, and these sorts of things. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, you can get these specialists, and I think in the future we'll have more of those people, like a developer on the product ops team. Oh my gosh, would I love that. There are so many integrations and APIs that I want somebody to interact with that I don't want to go and set up in Zapier or something like that. That would be amazing. That would be a force multiplier for our team. For example, like right now at Dashlane, what I have to rely on are tight partnerships with our research team and our product analytics team and our revenue operations team. And this can get pretty complicated. But if you centralize these groups into like your virtual ops, group that you're talking about, Chris, you might have a more unified strategy. And I don't think, by the way, that an org design precludes you from having a unified operations strategy. I think you could still do that with your champions internally. Just maybe a little bit more meeting organization and stuff. But I think it's really important to do that And I think that we're going to start seeing that more as product operations teams mature, grow, learn new things, start solving new problems, and especially with all of the AI stuff that we've got going, enabling those tools. I think we were just talking about it before we started. Like, it's so easy to create a status report with AI as long as you can make the connections right and get your prompts right. And having a good prompt engineer there or somebody that can work on tying those information sources together, I think will be critical, moving forward for our role.
I mean, maybe we're also talking about the difference in types of organizations, because I think, for organizations where they have really tall hierarchies in particular practices, so like the idea of versus the idea of like a general manager type of role, right? I think that this is where previous operational roles like design ops, for example, there's this idea of kind of, I think, and actually, if we go back far enough, we can just talk about like design, right? Design went through this like maturity scale of it was like only outside, like 0 was we didn't do it, right? We just didn't care about design. Just engineers were building things. Then we started hiring consultants to come in and maybe as designers to help us with interaction. Then we had centralized teams inside the org, and then we had embedding inside of every single one. And so I think it feels like every maturity scale, and again, I hate maturity scales because I think they oversimplify things down to like one line when the reality is just like very multidimensional as far as complexity. But like every single one of those seems to point to the fact that embedding is very important in some way, because that cross-functionalness of the team ends up being really important. So then I guess the question is like, if we had this cross-functional type of ops organization where it was PM, engineering, and design together, but they're building operational things, right? Where would that sit inside the org, and what would their kind of like charter be? I think is a really interesting question. I don't think we've gotten there yet, right? Like I don't think most organizations do not think about this. I mean, I think this is going to be, I believe it's a multiplier for the teams to actually improve the way that we end up working. It's very hard to convince people of that right now. And that's why like operationally you end up seeing these silos. But I could see this if we're saying in the future, we want to have cross-functional groups that are operational, that are building great things for the way the org works. And it's not the way that HR is, right? Which again is like the way people work together, kind of. But it's usually just the worst cases. And so, I mean, the ones that are like proactive and actually trying to evolve organizations, right? That I think I could see it having different types of views for that. And it could be more overall, but I would argue that I think you need to have much more of an understanding of the people that are involved as well. And so that says to me that you can't scale these types of things into thousands of people for one team. Because I think that like you will have to focus on the personalities that are there too, right? Like I think that is something that we miss. This is the reason why, like, to me, I'm like almost like the anti-process PM, like a product ops person, is because of the fact that it's really about how the people work together, how they form those relationships, how they end up actually building trust in some way. And it's very much not about like a process. Now, one of my pet peeves is that if we have a process and it's not working, and we continue to let it kind of like limp along, like, and I keep on getting in trouble because no one's complying to it and everything. Like, to me, that's where we then need to reassess like what's going on with the people. And so, but I am very dependent on process when it's set, but when it's not working, we should be going back to this. It's almost like in Cynefin, which is by Dave Snowden, is this like framework of like domains of clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic, and then disorders is like a little domain in the middle you can get stuck in sometimes. But this like liminality between complicated and complex, we're figuring things out between the people. We want to turn something into a process with a tool that goes into complicated. But there's also the opposite, which is that this system's not working the way it should anymore. We need to break down this tool and go back over to the complex lens of the way that the organization is working. And so, I think I got a little off topic there, but like I think there's something really important about just in general. Right now, these roles are very siloed, and that's why I think we need to allow for that tension to be between them in some way.
Very interesting listening to this. I'm just going to just jump in here because, I've got my own thoughts on supporting the wider business. Antonia, very similar to what you've talked about, in the ability to support the particularly the commercial side of the business in a typical SaaS setup, in supporting the sales, the marketing, the delivery, the support teams, not in terms of necessarily their day-to-day, because they have or will be having their own ops functions as well. But actually, or
enablement or whatever they call it, right? Like there's a couple different terms.
Absolutely. But actually, in supporting them interacting with the very smallest, the product, at the biggest, and I usually kind of use interchangeably the tech side of the business. If you've got the tech side of the business and the commercial side of the business, how do those two interact with each other successfully for the success of the entire business? So, I mean, that's certainly something I've focused a lot of my time on, is actually how does the tech side of the business interact with what the commercial side needs? A kind of pseudo terminology that I use is, if you think about majority of people in our businesses, those people at the pointy end, so your product managers, your engineers, your salesmen, your marketers, your support people, these are all people that, you know, if you really break it down to its most fundamental level, why do we really hire them? Well, we hire salespeople to, let's face it, sell the product. We hire engineers to, let's face it, write code. You know, if you want to simplify it that far down. So, and they are all things that product ops and other ops roles are trying to facilitate and enable them to do those primary tasks as well and as efficiently as possible.
Effectively.
Thank you, Antonia. Absolutely. So this brings me on to one interesting point, because what we've started to talk about here, and Chris, I feel like you've leaned into this quite a lot, is the idea, and if I'm wrong, do correct me, of almost a sub-layer within a business. So we've now talked about those people at the pointy end, those people on the front line are doing those things. And now what we're talking about is a sub-framework of, or super framework, whatever you want to call it, of people that are there supporting that are sitting there internally, lots of different ops roles helping different elements of those businesses, of the business, sorry. And they're all interconnected in that kind of community of practice, in that kind of virtual department. And that's a really, really interesting kind of, at least visually, a real dynamic. You've got the business as people see it, and then you've got the sub-layer of the way that the business operates internally. And I think that's really a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, that's originally what managers were there to do, right? And that's why we have hierarchies of leaders. I think a lot of this comes from the background of like Taylorism, which is very much focused on the scientific management of people, which, if you believe people are cogs in a machine, that is the right way to do it. You want to have a manager that is making sure they're as efficient, and I use efficient as a specific word rather than effective, right, as possible. And that's why like managers exist, is to do that. Now, there's a bunch of different things that managers should be doing, right? It could be around their operational stuff, right? Like there's a writer that talks about like engineering strategy. And well, I dislike X strategy or blank strategy as things, basically. Like what he's talking about is he's really talking about the way they do work within this organization from a leader perspective, right? For this org, this is how we work, right? And that to me is like operational type of stuff. I would also say that, you know, that's one thing that a manager might do. They might do performance management. They might do what the opposite of performance management is, coaching and mentoring. And they might also just be a leader, right? Like a lot of the times the leader is there because they own this entire area inside of the product, say from a PM perspective, right? And so they're there to help make decisions well. I think once we start getting into this future, if you look at kind of orgs or different types of org designs, like, and again, holacracy basically failed because no one is adopting it, right? And the reason why is because this idea of like no hierarchies right now, at least, means that it's very hard to judge performance of people. And then shadow systems of performance end up being created. And it's more about like whether that person, that this practice lead likes you or not, kind of. And I believe like team cohesion is actually like a very valid way to judge performance. But I would just say, like, I think we get into this weird realm is like, what does happen when, you know, if we talk about all the mechanizations that need to happen start to be put in place? Because like, when we talk about like all the use of AI right now, like maybe we still need hyper-specific needs around engineering to be able to create something that can create a process. But there's a lot of like low and no code tools. Like even inside of GitHub, we're experimenting with using something called Workspace to be able to create automations, right? And so this is like, basically, I think we get into this realm of like, what are these like this? And sorry, I just feel like there's this need around how do we the reason why we have hierarchies, I think, is going to start to break down over time. And I think we're going to need them less and less as Mechanation does some of this stuff, but it's still going to be about people working with each other. And so I think there is like a real need for that thing. I mean, one of the key conversations we had when we were setting up the portfolio ops practice in GitHub was really, who is our key stakeholder? Is it the leaders or is it the ICs? And we have so far focused on the leaders, and I am starting to realize that I think that's a mistake. And so, not that they're bad in any way, but that like they're doing a different type of job than those ICs are. And the ICs at the pointy end of the spear type of thing, like those are the ones that I think we should still be really worried about. And the use of a manager, like, or as a leader, like, is it my job to just make sure I like write all their status reports and all of the like upward facing product reviews? Am I just shepherding them between meetings so they can say yes or no to something? Like, what is the goal of like these types of leaders longer term? And if they're not communicating their strategy, if they're not making it apparent, they're not training the strategy into the people that they're working with, like, I think that's where, I don't know, the future of this type of thing ends up being about this like meta layer of like, how does the organization work versus what are the people that are doing the work? Yeah. Right. And so I do think there's a distinction there in some way. Sorry, that was a little rambling, but I think there's like a lot of ideas to unpack here is what I think needs to happen. Right.
Yeah, I think that what you're touching on, to go back to the original sort of topic, right? Like, is product operations a PM of PMs, or is it more holistic? Is the scope more broad? I think that with any system, whatever you add is going to create a complexity, like a consequence, I'll say, rather. It may not be a complexity, it may be very simple, but I find this, as I ascribe to the idea that we're the PMs for maybe the product operations as a whole, and we're there to make teams effective, not so much the PM of PMs. I find myself often coming into this conflict with management theory. So I'm really glad you brought that up. What is management versus operations? Where do we draw that line? Because we've added this new operations function into the system, well, now we have a question and answer. How do we divide and conquer? And so if I think forward for the future, I think you're absolutely right that management need is going to change. Maybe it's a division of strategy, and operations is there to help support the strategy and help, continuously adapt that strategy through information and insights. And the managers are focused on that strategy. Maybe we're there to enable better performance management through internal metrics, if that's what's needed, for example. But maybe managers are no longer, doing all the things that they do all the time. Maybe performance management is going to get thrown out the window. Wouldn't that be nice? But I think
I had to set up a performance management system for PMs at Cognizant, and that is like a really hard task, and it really sucks to have to work on. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, it is tough. And I think that as we start to see new people joining the workforce that are thinking about these things in terms of systems rather than individuals, we're going to start to get more and more of those conflicts with people that have been doing product management for decades, and they think of doing things one way. You're going to get conflict with these people. I've experienced it myself. I'm sure people have experienced lots of personalities in their time. But I think we need to find a way to navigate this. And I think that's why it's so important for us to say that product operations is there not just for the PMs, because I think this is actually a good thing. I think we do need to change the way that organizations function because we have new technology. The market is different now. And we need to think more holistically about the systems and drive that change. For me, product operations people, if I was going to hire a product operations manager, I want them to be curious and I want them to be a champion for change. And I think that we need to continue pushing on that.
Yeah, I think this is really, really interesting, right? And I think this is in order for product operations to become more, I don't want to use the word legitimate, but you know what I mean? Like more widespread, right?
Yeah.
We do actually need to address those questions because this is one of the biggest pushbacks I've experienced, even when simply just talking to product leaders, right? Like there is this really deep notion that we're actually taking part of their core work away from them, right? And it requires a rephrasing of what product leadership actually is, right? A CPO's job, in my opinion, should not be product operations, right? That is the lowest level sort of importance. It needs to get done. They need to see to it that it gets done, but they don't need to do it themselves, right? However, I think the reality is that for a lot of product leaders, that's the most tangible part of their work. That's maybe the part that they might also be most confident in, right? And when you introduce this new function that says, hey, let me take this off your plate, suddenly things become scary. And I think that's when conflicts start to arise.
Well, I guess I would argue that those managers are not doing that job right now. Like most of the time when we talk about change inside of an organization, it's usually in crisis mode, right? Like there's some problem where we tried to ship something and there was a problem between teams, or PM didn't understand the thing that needed to happen. Process wasn't followed the way it was supposed to, whatever that means, right? And they step in and kind of say, hey, I'm going to fix this. This is the new process, right? When the reality is like, I guess, yes, there is a time and place for crisis style change, right? Because that actually helps, whether it's manufactured or real crisis, by the way. But like, I do think that is the problem, is that it should be part of these managers' jobs, but they are being, not only pushed, like if you look at the Amazon announcement, they're going to be flattening their org. And so what that means is that rather than when I was at Microsoft, right, we would say that for every direct you had to spend 20% of your time on them. And so that maxes you out at five people, right? Like 15 is not going to work, especially when we talk about like more junior employees that need more coaching, right? And so I think that's the problem, is that in this world that we're existing in today, like, yes, that should have been the manager's work. They're just not doing it usually. And that they're just kind of like using power structures to get what they want done. And so that's why I think like product ops is there to help with that. I think I think people that are leaders end up misunderstanding. They're like, oh, I can just give this person the extra work I don't want to do. When the reality is, it's like, no, I'm going to be here to push you to be a better leader and to help the team be better at what they do. And I think that is a very important thing to specialize in, especially because of practice differences. And so I would, again, still make that argument that I think there's a reason for us to silo a little bit when it comes to this.
It's interesting.
Well, that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting point, right? Because you mentioned, right, process or any system change introduced by the person who pays your salary, right, will be adopted, whether only in appearance or truthfully, right? And I think that's what makes the product ops job so interesting, because we're nobody's manager, right? The people we're asking to change need to do so because we have found common ground, right? Because we both believe that this is the best step forward. And that's a very, very interesting dimension to look at.
Well, and that's why I think like the metrics are really for us about the idea of engagement in the things that we set up or help people do. And not in a way that's like, hey, I need more engagement, I'm going to like engagement farm people. But it's like, there's no engagement. That means there's clearly a signal something's going wrong right now, and I need to work on that. And then the other side is attrition and retention of PMs. Like, people will leave for a lot of different reasons, but if they're leaving because it's too hard to get their work done, or systemically they're being put in a place that they can't do great work, that is something I then see as my problem in some way. So yeah, sorry.
I'm really glad that we brought up, the leadership and what we're asking them to do. And particularly in this time, we've covered a lot of this just now about, the times that we're in. We know we're putting more and more pressure on less and less, or more people, less people, but with less people to help and support them, with so many redundancies, like you say, Amazon flattening structures, et cetera, et cetera. So this brings me back actually to the piece I was saying earlier about what is it that those people on the front line, and we now include managers and product leaders in that, what is it we really ask them to do? What is it we really need them to be doing? And in the most simplistic form, line managing, in terms of, managing the strategy, managing the C-suite, managing the board, everything else, in that true stereotypical manager sense. And so actually, when we're talking about the changes that wants to come in, we've started to say, should this be part of the product leadership, line management kind of responsibilities? Yes, it kind of should be, but with all the pressures and the changes in the way that we work, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years in software, there isn't enough time in the day to be doing all of that. There's so much for them to be doing under those original guises that now trying to roll out, we want to roll out new discovery practices, initiative that's come down. Okay, fantastic. But logistically, how am I going to be able to do that successfully other than telling my next line down, go and make it happen? And then they go and make it happen. And it's uncoordinated. Different teams do different things at different paces. And again, that's where product operations, I've always felt, supports as much product leadership in that very logistical sense, in saying, well, okay, look, this is the strategy of what you want to do. Now let me take it. And logistically, how are we going to do this? How am I going to manage this over the long term on behalf of you, product leader, on behalf of the entire team, so that it is successful, where that product leader just doesn't physically have the time? And whether that's how it should be is one thing or another. The reality we all know is that they just won't. It won't happen. And I think that's where product ops also sees or can see a great deal of success.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something there. We often say we're here to empower product teams, right? With information, with the ability to self-serve, all of that. Who empowers us? Who empowers a product operations person? It's a system of trust. A lot of times you're hired in to solve a problem, and they're like, "Cool, you can go and do it." Maybe that's it. Maybe it's somebody worked with a product operations person before, or maybe they're hiring this person to just execute what they want to do. That leader is. They already have an idea in their mind of how products should work, and they just want you to go and offload that task for them. And I think this sort of gets into some of the anti-patterns of product ops, but also highlights a need for us to advocate for our own empowerment. So what you're talking about, Graham, is you have a strategy, you don't have enough time. Let me take this from you. Let's be partners. Not so much a chief of staff in that I'm going to serve you. I'm going to push you, like you're saying, Chris. I'm going to make sure that we're doing the right things in a way that meets the needs of the business. We're going to do working backwards approaches from these deadlines. We're going to work with what you need from the board and make sure that these things get actioned on. We're going to reduce our work in progress, all of these things. But we're not going to be actually doing the user research. We're not actually going to be doing the data analysis for the most part. I will add an asterisk to that. I think there is some stuff that we can do there, especially with internal operations metrics. But I think that self-advocacy is the way that we ensure a better way of working and a better sort of division of labor, I would say, between management and leadership and operations moving forward.
I think once we acknowledge that change requires a lot of work inside of like an organization. So yes, a leader says we're adopting this new process, everybody just make it work. Right. That is the mode that usually happens today. But if we actually do this in like a participatory way, we end up creating something that is not only the team dynamic, but the ritual and routine in how people can start to make their work more dependable in some way. And that requires an awful lot. Like I think, again, I've rolled like 4 or 5, maybe 6 different types of status processes throughout like every single time I join somewhere new, and they always end up failing in like kind of the same way, which is that people stop caring about it. And I guess what I'm trying to do this time is like we're 2 months into a current status review process, and so I've been starting to ask people, how does this fit into your day to day? How much time does it take? What is the mental how much mental load does this take for you to do? How good do you think you do it? Right? What are things that we're missing and that you need from this process? And so I think like all that stuff requires real work, right? And I think I keep on talking about this book, The Problem with Change, as being, I think, like a quintessential product operations book. And the reason why is because people don't want to constantly have things like their feet taken out from underneath them with new process.
Yeah.
Our job is change, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But I think more critically, there's a difference between descriptivism and prescriptivism. And when it comes to product operations, we should be focusing more on continuous descriptivism. That means deconstructing a process and continuously improving upon that thing. But we have to start with describing it. If we come into an organization where like, all right, PRDs are written this way, and we're going to have these meetings all the time. it's gonna fail. You might get some good adoption for the first month or something, but it's gonna fall apart. But you have to describe, you have to work with them, be co-conspirators and collaborators with those people, especially if you don't have that empowerment that I was talking about at the outset. But I think that, like, that to me is a core tenet. This comes from linguistics, by the way. Like, we describe languages, we don't prescribe them because they're organic and they change. So do systems, so do teams and those dynamics.
Well, I think this is related to the fact that, like, we're thinking these things are technical problems rather than social problems, right? And I think that comes from, like, I think it's really interesting that there's, like, from the linguistics world, like, I think that's the reason why also I think, like, product ops people need to be very meta-disciplinary in the way that we end up understanding things. And I think that's starting to happen more and more. But, like, I think this is the reason why, like, meetings and the cadence of meetings that we end up helping set up as, like, a very tactical thing ends up being thought of as just like a technical issue. We just need to have an agenda before we get in this meeting room and it will be perfect. When the reality is, like, there's so many things that go into a meeting and how this fits as, like, an input and output of a bunch of other things that we need to be considering. And this is, again, that comes then from, like, service design, right? We're not looking at just our product, but how does that product sit in situ with, like, everything else that's going on? And so, I agree with you about that. Absolutely.
I feel there's so much that goes into product operations that's not technical, that's not process, and I've long really felt that actually this is a very much not just a people role, but there's so much elements of psychology, there's so much elements of behavior analysis, behavior management in what we do. We've just talking, Christopher, you were just talking there, like, about
group therapy.
Group therapy, absolutely as well. Yeah, absolutely. Christopher, you were just talking there about wanting to really be very, or not being prescriptive. This is what we're going to do, and off we go and do it, and actually deconstructing it. And I absolutely agree with that, because another part of something I talk about quite a lot is actually the importance of taking time to embed new habits that what we're doing, the changes that we're talking about making in any way, shape or form of the processes. Creating the process and rolling the process out is absolutely one thing. But what's the point in doing that is, and Chris, I think you said this as well, is after 1 month, nobody bothers doing it anymore. Nobody looks at it. Nobody follows it anymore. Because actually we tried to do too much too fast, or actually if we're not embedded this properly into our teams, where these changes work best is if they are embedded as a new habit that people don't even think about doing it anymore. If we all think about when we first learned to drive a car, we didn't probably get into a car and go, right, I've got to do everything. Here's the gears, there's the steering wheel, everything I've got to do with that. I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to do parking. I'm going to do parallel parking. We're doing everything. No, we built it up over a period of time. And if we had lessons, we did those lessons and we repeated and repeated and repeated until actually we got to a point whereby we are now driving for so many years and we don't even think about it. God forbid, and I do this quite often, we drive and we get out of the car and think, how on earth did I get here? It's so embedded into what we do. And I look at product operations in terms of that understanding of how people behave, how people react to change. Is so important in terms of our wanting to embed those new habits, so that actually these new changes, these new processes we're putting in are not laborious, are not things that people really have to think about. Oh my God, I've got to do it this way, and then I've got to do that, and I've got to do that. Actually, they get to a stage, hopefully quite quickly, whereby they just do it and they notice that efficiency coming through. And so it's really interesting that we've kind of really now kind of organically moved into this part of the conversation of talking about how people behave, how people react, and it's such an important part of what we do in this role, I feel.
Well, can I just interject before we get the conversation going? I think here's my conflict, right? I very much agree with everything we've said sort of in the latter part of the podcast. It is a human role, it's a change role, it's a systems role, right? It's meta-disciplinary. I love that. How do you sell that? How do you sell that to somebody who isn't quite convinced yet without reverting back to saying, I make it more effective. I make it more efficient. I make sure people attend this meeting. I make sure people read your 14-page strategy document. I think that's the challenge we have.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, don't write a 14-page strategy document. I would but,
no one's going to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess like the one thing I would say is I would ask the question, like, so far, have you felt like the team works well together? And have you felt like you've retained your best employees? And have you felt like over time, like things are getting better here? Right. Like if something I hear from a lot of leaders is they're like, I want to make like product management fun again. Right. And it's like, part of the reason why it's not fun or not interesting or not exciting or not meaningful is because of the fact that we are over focused on efficiency and that technocratic version of the solution rather than the way that we work. And so it's hard to get through to leaders that have been in power, though, because they see their job as telling people how to do things rather than creating the environments by which people will do great things. And so that's usually my argument. Now, it's very hard to get people to see outside of their kind of set of certainties about the world. But I've been able to do it. I mean, it takes a lot of trust building with the leader, but there have been times where I've done something that, and I worked with one leader who would kind of pejoratively say that the things I did were like too smart or cutesy when it came to like, the way that we do stuff. I took that as like a signal that he actually was starting to understand that like there's a reason why we just don't do things the same way every single time, and it's because we want to do it in a better way. So yeah. Anyways, I had to just live with the fact that I was doing things that were too smart or cutesy for a little while, but it worked. It started working a little bit at least.
Yeah, I think I've also fallen into this trap, but when it comes to selling this back, I would also advocate for not selling snake oil in this scenario. Don't be like, I'm your product operations person and I'm going to make everybody an efficient robot. But I love this metaphor, but I'm also getting tired of it. But like treat everything like a product can lead you down a thought path that is really helpful in this scenario. What you're describing,
you should maybe PM this experience in some way? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying take it one level higher than this, right? Like the outcomes that you described. Are your teams working better together? Is PMing fun? Are your PMs having fun interacting with their partners? Does everything feel like a chore, or is it super stressful to get something done?
Like pulling
You're describing
teeth.
The outcomes of, yeah, exactly, pulling teeth. If we describe things like a product and what our product is supposed to do, I mean, we do this when we're selling a product too, right? Like this is going to help you, I don't know, make slides better. This is going to help you like corral your data. Whatever product we're selling, we're focusing on the outcomes for our users. And I think this is where, for me, the argument of PMing the PM experience kind of falls apart, because I'm focusing on the outcomes of the system. I'm saying we want our product teams to do these things. And that's not always a key responsibility of a PM. It's not always something that they can control. Maybe they're the input or the catalyst for something. But it's not always them. Maybe it's having an honest conversation with my product marketing team that they need to read the things that our PMs are creating so that they can create their content, versus asking them to fill out an entirely different template, because that's duplicate work and it's just waste. But that takes a lot of politics and negotiation and, like I said, empowerment. But I think if we focus on this as a product, then we can describe the inputs and the outputs of that system and push back on our leaders and say, these are the inputs that your teams need to be effective. These are the outcomes that we want to achieve together. And if something's not working in between, product operations is there to measure, monitor, describe continuously how we can make these things better, notice those bottlenecks, notice those opportunities for improvement. And then as we scale, we'll get more disciplined in that. We'll hire more people to, look deeply into how we conduct discovery or research. If it takes us a month at a time, every time we approach a new problem to do all this discovery stuff, you probably want to minimize that. That's a little expensive, right? Especially for continuously delivering things. So I think it depends on the problems that you're trying to solve, but you have to describe it end to end. For me, that's the first thing that I would do as a product operations person.
I mean, I would argue that the things that have worked well over time has been kind of project management is something that, again, probably has over 100 or so years of like actual experience. There's certification programs, there's all those things. And so I think like we're not having a problem right now of trying to be more efficient. Like there's always that drive to go towards that. And so to me, again, the reason why like PMing the PM experience is such like a valuable lens is because I think if we look at the spectrum between project management project management is about, and again, I'm putting out whatever titles you want to put there, right? Like TPM in some cases, program management, but those are about like reducing risk of delivery. And it's about making it consistent and, like a regular way to do this. I would argue that product management and the times that are like actually necessary, that is pushing innovation in some way. And so that's why a lot of the time, the reason why I'm so focused on PMs is because in this like standard development lifecycle or continuous deployment, continuous planning plus deployment, whatever you want to call those things, there are inputs that PMs are probably not getting the chance to do that they should. So like a key one tends to be around conceptual approval within the organization upfront. Like, how do we decide to invest in this? That is not just a leader grabbing a team of people and saying, work on this thing, right? How do we actually talk about it in service of the outcomes, which again, I would deprioritize the outcome for product ops, but for the PM, they should really understand, is this in alignment with the strategy? Is it part of the decision-making model that we should be doing? Is it trading off the right things for business value versus customer value? That type of thing. And then the other side is like, go to market, right? How do we end up working as PMs, if I put on that hat, to be able to get the message out with PMMs, marketing, sales, enablement, all that type of stuff. And so I guess that's what I'm saying is like, I think there's also maybe one last little piece is this idea of like trade-off discussions and how we have good ones inside of that development process. But that's why I focus on those things so much as like PMing the PM experience, is because I think that is where we're lacking a lot of this kind of rigor. And the rigor is not PMs are following this explicit process, but it's that they're allowing, and maybe this is something, Graham, that stuck with me when you were talking about the idea of like, people should be able to feel probably flow is one way to put it. I would argue that we also need to have moments of like severe disagreement. And the reason why is because, especially in the decision-making process, like the discourse part of decision-making requires us to kind of like add, create, modify, discard options usually. And so that is the point that we should be arguing. And actually we should be woken up from our slumber of like flow processes to have those types of arguments too. So that's why like, I think like there's a very particular view of how product management as a practice is still pretty new, decades old, right? It is something that is often misunderstood. And I think that product ops is there to actually help them be better understood and show the true value of where their position is inside of that. And that's why, again, I would argue that like focusing on them as a practice ends up, I think, giving us more of that benefit rather than talking about the overall kind of thing. Because, again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be forming these virtual ops groups by any means. We should have those. But inside those things, we also talk about the friction, or not friction, the tension between, TPM will want to do something a certain way, and I'll say this is not going to be good for the way PMs need to work. And that discussion is really, really important to have from those two different positions, rather than the idea of like, I'm internalizing these three people, and so it's what's best for all of these different groups of people, rather than try to focus. So,
yeah, love that. We are about out of time now, so I'd like to just ask each of you 1 minute to, what's your final thoughts on based upon what we've discussed here in particular as well. Your thoughts on kind of product ops for PM in the PM experience. Chris, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, so, I've been listening to this podcast for a while. And so whenever you say that PMing, it's not just PMing the PM experience, I felt personally attacked. So thank you for letting me come on here to defend my position. But beyond that, I mean, again, I just want to, I think that the real benefit of this is that we do what's best for a customer, and the product that we have, which I believe is community practice and development of community practice, is so important, I think, to the way that product management is going to exist in this world. And so that's why I think it's very valuable. I will concede, though, that I think that there's a future where we need to think about organizational dynamics overall. And I wonder whether it is the similar thing where we have different positions inside of the EPD or the triad that pull in different directions. And is it groups of people like that that are then doing this kind of like overall kind of what does management of the future mean, or organizational design of the future mean? And so anyways, I think there's like, for now, I think it is very effective to PM the PM experience. I could see, though, that like we're starting to do that at GitHub, where we start to form these virtual ops teams. So that's why like I think I see that future as well of thinking about more overall structures too.
Awesome. Christopher, over to you.
Yeah, I think that I agree with a lot of the things that that you said here today, Chris. And honestly, for me, it's a really important reminder to not lose sight of the fact that product managers are very important. Like if we try to solve too many problems at once, we might lose sight of some very important ones that we do need to solve. And so for me, while I'm not totally convinced that it is right, I don't think, I think we still need to focus on it. I think that it's not right. I guess I will say. So we do still need to focus on those PMs. We do need to make sure that they are empowered, though. We need to make sure they have the right information. And I think if we focus on that, and as a community, a product operations community, focus on that future where we want operations to be and work backwards from that, we can continue to innovate and drive change as a community for what we need to do. And folks like you talking about how you're forming these virtual ops groups is super empowering, especially to new product operations people, which we also need to not lose sight of. We need to keep the discussion going and keep educating them and learning from fresh eyes. So I'm really appreciative of this conversation. I think it's really helpful.
Awesome. Antonia.
Yeah, I mean, lots of really interesting opinion. I think, Chris, you and I have been on a few panels now. I know, like, every single time we're on a panel together, I know it's going to be a hoot just because there's lots of amazing things to learn from you and Christopher as well, obviously, and Graham. I think something that really sticks with me is this idea of a kind of chief noticer, right? A systems thinker that is hired to think in systems and to sort of, examine how work gets done. I think for me, that is the thing that was most compelling about product operations. I love that I can marry this with my expertise and background in product management specifically. But I think looking at organizations as organisms, right, as living things that we can sort of mold and help guide and sort of direct, that's something that I'm really, really looking forward to in the future, for sure.
Awesome. And just for me, I mean, Antonia, that's a brilliant piece that you just said there about kind of this organism that's growing and how are we supporting that life support of that organism. And I still am really wedded to Chris, the piece that you was talking about, and we kind of discussed upon about this almost lattice of operational people that support, as Antonia said, that organism. I think that's a really exciting future, and a really exciting kind of future. I think, as you said as well, about for management as well. What does the future of management look like in that? Which is actually something I've not really considered before. So I think that's, it's been fantastic to speak to all of you today. And before I just kind of wrap up with my usual kind of end spiel to thank you, I want to put another thank you to everyone here, Chris and Christopher in particular, because I think today we have talked a lot about things that might, for some of our audience, might be quite difficult for them to imagine, let alone implement into their lives. And ordinarily, we would see this in lots of other kind of gurus and professionals on the LinkedIn space. But I really do feel both of you have approached this in a way that is super accessible, even if it's not accessible in terms of I can run away and do this. You've explained it in a way that is incredibly aspirational, saying this is where the future could be. And that is a real difference. I'm going to get down off my soapbox in a minute. That's a real difference in how experts should be talking about, these advanced ways of working that not all of us, not everybody would have that real opportunity to do, but make it aspirational. But it's clearly aspirational. We've not turned around and said, if you're not doing this, Chris in particular, the work that you're doing at Cover, if you're not doing it this way, then you are not doing it right. And I really want to thank you for really approaching it in that way, both of you, all of us here in this discussion. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe the last thing I would just add is, like, I think this is the issue with, we should be pushing our teams to do a better job around these things. And I think it is an ops, just like PM should be asking another question about, is this actually valuable? Is this the right thing to do? We should be saying the same thing. Is this a change that is really worthwhile for the team, right? Is this going to cause more harm than good right now, based on what we understand? And so I think asking those additional questions is what I'm really pushing people to do. It doesn't mean that you won't still be asked to implement a status reporting structure and just go do it, right? That's going to happen. Okay, that will happen. But at least from there, maybe if we can ask like some more questions and we can back into maybe what is actually the need here and how do we do it in a way that is really helpful for people, I think that makes our roles better and more valuable. And that's what I want to see, is I want to see us like really doing a better job for our teams, because PMs are asked to do so much. We need to help them. That's our role.